Well, I love to travel. And one of the places on my bucket list, I don't know if I'll ever get to go or not, is that little bitty, there's a bigger red spot and then there's a little bitty red spot. One of the places that I would really like to go to before I die is to Greece. I would love to go to Greece. And Crete, which is that little red spot, that is a part of Greece. And I love the beaches. And I would love the mountains. And I would love the plains. It has fertile valleys and plains and a long coastline. Some of y'all have been to the beach this summer. I'm extremely jealous. From the travel brochures, I believe I would love the food. I love Greek Mediterranean food. I think I would love the ancient ruins. I love history, so I would love traipsing through those. And I think I would love the people, because here's what I know. Every time they have any kind of celebration, even in the church, you know what they do? They do those circle dances. And I think I would love that. I would love getting in one of those circles and doing circle dances with all those people. Now, they have fun. And I love a little fun in worship. I would definitely enjoy a vacay there. Hint, hint, Mr. Cantrell. Well, Crete's been around a long time. It's been a civilized place for a long time. In the days of the Apostle Paul, it wasn't a tourist destination like it is now. It was a working seaport, and it had a bad, B-A-D reputation. This was a place where pirates hung out. The Romans began to dominate the Mediterranean region in the 2nd century, and that included Crete. So the Roman governor came in and ruled the province, and it was a difficult place to rule, because these people didn't want to be ruled. Here's a little about their reputation, and note, everything that I'm about to share with you I pulled from history books, and none of it's from Christian writers. This is from their own people from Paul's day. Listen to what they have to say about them. Cretans, and yes, they are called Cretans. Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons, lacking ethical principles, stealing and harboring robbers and pirates. Another Greek historian by the name Polybius made the following comments. Money is so highly valued among them that its possession is not only thought to be necessary, but in the highest degree credible. And in fact, greed and the excessive, insatiable desire for wealth are so native to the soil in Crete that they are the only people in the world among whom no stigma is attached when people do anything to get money. Cretans, by their ingrained greediness, are engaged in countless public and private seditions, murders, and civil wars. Welcome to Crete. In other words, the general population of this place in Paul's day was so consumed by money and possessions and evil that they really believed it was okay to lie. It was okay to cheat as long as there was gain from it. It was okay to steal if you could gain from it. And it was okay to kill if it paid off. For our purposes, and we know this from Titus 1:5, that there were some churches that sprung up on Crete, on this dishonest island. I had to ask the question, and then I had to research it. So how did Christians get in that place? And it's believed because of what we read in Acts on Pentecost. There were people from Crete at Pentecost. There were people from Crete at Pentecost, and they took the gospel back to Crete and shared it, and churches sprung up. While we have no mission account recorded, we do know in Acts, there's nothing recorded in Acts, because it has not all the travels of Paul, but travels of Paul. We don't have a story about Crete in there, but it's believed that at some point Paul actually was there or visited, or he may have schooled some of the Cretan leaders, one of the two. But whatever happened, they gave Paul the authority to speak to them, to speak truth to them in those churches. So, because of that, we're going to look at a letter that Paul wrote to the churches in Crete. It was to a missionary and pastor by the name of Titus. I want to give you all this cultural information because much of what we will see in the book of Titus is directed to a specific church in a specific place at a specific time. That's really important that we understand this. So, when we look at the book of Titus, or when you're reading the book of Titus in your own devotions, or if you do a Bible study on Titus, it is smart. You do well to look for the principles in Titus rather than looking at it literally. If you look at Titus literally, it can cause some real confusion. So we have to be careful when we're reading a letter that was as specific. Some of Paul's letters are not. Some of Paul's letters were meant to be read in buku churches, and they have deep theological stuff in them that anybody can read and understand and take truth from. Titus, we have to be a little more careful with. So, I think our best bet when we look at Titus, and I want us to look at Titus, because I think it has a lot to say to our culture. I think we will look at it and look for principles as we read this book and as we go through it for the next few weeks. I'd like for all of us to stand. I'm going to read the first section from Titus chapter 1. You will find that book. Orville jokingly walked by me this morning and said, "You better tell people where to look for Titus." Titus is about 3/4 of the way through the New Testament. It's after the 2 books of Timothy. It's a little bitty book, so you'll have to turn to it unless you're using your media, and then it's easy. I'm going to be using... let's see, I think I'm using the New Century Version this morning. Had to think a minute which one I chose. Hear the word of the Lord. From Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ. I was sent to help the faith of God's chosen people and to help them know the truth that shows people how to serve God. That faith and that knowledge come from the hope for life forever, which God promised to us before time began. And God cannot lie. At the right time, God let the world know about that life through preaching. He trusted me with that work, and I preached by the command of God our Savior. To Titus, my true child in the faith we share, grace and peace from God the Father and Jesus Christ our Lord. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Yeah, thank you. Well, we learn a little bit about Titus, not only from this letter, but we learn a little bit about him from some of Paul's other books. One of them is 2 Corinthians. Galatians and 2 Timothy. And we find a story about Titus in the book of Galatians that I want to share with you. Here's what was happening. Paul had been preaching. It was early in his ministry, and he had been preaching to Gentiles. Now, we have to understand that when the early church was the early church, it was Jewish people first who believed in Jesus. And scattered among them were some Gentiles, because we find that in the Gospels, we find that in Acts. Well, Paul is writing to the church of Galatia, and he's telling them that there was conflict. There was conflict in the early church. Can you imagine conflict in the church? Nothing new. And in the early church, there was conflict, and the conflict, there were several issues, but the main issue was if people, Gentiles, believed in Jesus and came to know Jesus, did they have to become Jews? And the argument was, well, Jesus was a Jew. You see, that's a pretty good argument. That's a pretty good argument. And Paul, and as we know from Acts, Peter himself believed no, they did not. They did not have to become Jews to accept Jesus Christ and become a part of the kingdom of God. And Paul preached that diligently, and it caused some big time conflict. So Paul decides people are beginning to say, Paul has no authority. Paul's not one of the apostles. Don't even listen to him. So Paul goes to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples that are in charge, the apostles that are in charge in Jerusalem. And he goes and he meets with them about this issue. And guess who he takes as an example, to show as an example of what Jesus can do in a Gentile? He takes Titus. That is his example to the elders in Jerusalem and to the church broad of what God can do in somebody who didn't know anything about Jesus or God or anything like that. And Titus may have been a Zeus worshiper for all we know. But Jesus had done such a work in Titus's life that Paul used him as the example when he goes to Jerusalem to ask the church, can we share Jesus with the Gentiles and not expect them to become Jews? And guess what the elders in Jerusalem said? Go for it! So Titus must have made an incredible impression upon them. So that gives us a little information about who Titus was. Titus also became a trusted traveler with Paul, and Paul takes him with him to a really difficult church that had a whole lot of problems. It was the messiest church. Let me tell you, I've seen some pretty messy churches in my time. I've never seen one like the church in Corinth. The church in Corinth, if you ever want to read some R-rated stuff, go read the 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Because there was some mess going on in Corinth. And Paul's with Titus, or Titus is with Paul when he's in Corinth, and he becomes the peacemaker. Titus does. Titus becomes the ambassador. Titus is able to bridge people together. And he even confronts some opponents of Paul, and does it so much so that they agree with him, even though they're opponents. That's a pretty good diplomat. Titus has these abilities. And maybe that's why Paul sends Titus on a special assignment to one of the wildest, rowdiest, I mean, Sturgis has nothing on this place. Islands in the new Christian world. Paul sends Titus to Crete. It tells us how much confidence Paul had in this missionary. It's also refreshing to me to think about the fact that, God sends the right people to the right places. And I'm so glad. I feel like God sent Jay and I here, and you all have been the best, and still are. And it is a joy to be your pastor. And maybe when I get to heaven, I got a whole list of questions I want to ask people when I get to heaven, if I remember or care. And one of them's Titus. I want to ask Titus, by the time you left Crete, did you love those people and did they love you? Because I would guess that happened. Because he stayed in Crete. As a matter of fact, tradition holds that he became the bishop of the church in Crete. That means he was in charge of all the little churches. Because remember, in those days, they didn't have a church you went to. It was all house churches. And so they would have one person, a bishop, that oversaw all the house churches, because the house churches had their own leaders or pastors. Even though the language is not there, that's how it operated. And so I wanted you to get a little bit of a flavor for the place of Crete and who Titus was. I think it'll help us understand this letter a little bit. Because to be honest with you, there's some spots in this letter that are hard to digest. And here's what's interesting to me. I pulled this fact. I couldn't help myself. Do you know that more than 2,000 years after Titus was in Crete, you ready for this statistic? 90% of the people on Crete identify as Christian. Yeah, I got some questions for Titus. Wish I could ask them now. Let's go on to verse 5. I, Paul, left you, Titus, in Crete, so you could finish doing the things that still needed to be done, and so you could appoint elders in every town as I directed you. An elder must not be guilty of doing wrong, must have only one wife, and must have believing children. They must not be known as children who are wild and do not cooperate. As God's managers, overseers must not be guilty of doing wrong, being selfish, or becoming angry quickly. They must not drink too much wine, like to fight, or try to get rich by cheating others. Overseers must be ready to welcome guests, love what is good, be wise, live right, and be holy and self-controlled. By holding on to the trustworthy word just as we teach it, overseers can help people by using true teaching, and they can show those who are against the true teaching that they are wrong. Now, here we see some things that are really specific to the church in Crete. While Crete was under Roman rule, they were still very Greek. The people in Crete did not really become Roman. They stayed Greek as Greek could be. And Paul also mentions later in this letter that there were some folks in Crete who had a Jewish background, and they come into play a little later. So here we would do well to understand the role of women in this time and place. And I think you all know me well enough to know I don't have a chip on my shoulder. I don't have any chip on my shoulder about being a female pastor, because God Almighty called me, and I don't care what anybody on the face of the earth says or does. God called me. So I never worry about it. I've never had to have a chip. I've never even given it much thought. But here in Crete, we would do well to understand the role of Greek women, because this is a different culture than ours. And Greek culture in late Greek culture, which would be this time period, women had a limited public role, and they were confined to the domestic private home. Prostitution was big. It was big business. It was big time. And so married women, they're homebodies. And they're homebodies on purpose. They were excluded from political participation. They could not own, in the Greek world, they could not own property or inherit in many cases. In first century Judaism, since that comes into play later in the book, one of the elements in the Jewish world, you know, women were domestic in the Jewish world too. As a matter of fact, in the Jewish prayer book of that day, here is a morning prayer for you men to pray. And it went something like this. I thank God that I am not a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. So, yeah, in many respects. So, think about in Crete, in this culture, the roles of men and women were strictly set. The home was the primary place for women, and the public arena was for men. Women had a low position in society and in the family, so it makes, to me, perfect sense why Paul tells Titus here, you pick men, and you pick men with one wife. Number one, if he had put any women in a pastor role or a leadership role in Crete, they would not have gotten a second hearing out in the public. It wouldn't even have been a thing. And it would not have been safe for them to go out into the public to preach the gospel. So sometimes people will say, well, Titus says a woman can't be a pastor, that's got to be one man with one wife. Yes, in Crete it did. And that was wisdom on Paul's part, and that was wisdom on Titus's part. So I just want to get that cleared out of the air before we go any further, because I've heard that one used so many times. I can't even tell you how many times I've been told I'm sinning because Titus says. And I want to say, go study your history. Learn a little bit about Crete. I don't blame Paul. If I had been in charge, I'd have done the same thing. And I'm a woman. Because we're out to win Jesus however we can. And if it means I need to step back, I'm stepping back. And if it means I need to step up, I need to step up. There's your principle from Titus that we can learn from. If the general population was known to be liars and cheats, then a Christian leader must be the absolute opposite to get a hearing, much less gain respect. That's another one that you notice Paul said all this good character stuff Paul's talking about. They've got to be that way. They cannot. There are some things they cannot do on Crete, or they lose their credibility. And that whole thing about children, folks, I don't know about you, but I haven't always been able to control my children. And I didn't have any problem using the fly swat to help me do it. And I still couldn't always control my children. Here's what Paul's talking about here. Here's the principle. Because we're on Crete, did you know that on Crete, parents taught their children to steal very young. And they taught their children how to manipulate people to get money. They taught their children how to lie. So Paul hits this hard. He says your elders, your leaders in Crete have got to have children that aren't wild and going crazy and running amok with these children gang things. Because in Crete, that was normal. So the elders in Crete, the Christians in Crete, had to be different than what the culture was. That's pretty good principle. If the culture is evil, if we are in a culture where it's evil, we got to be the opposite. I can't, sometimes we want to snuggle up to sin as close as we can and we just won't commit it. I won't go all the way into there, but I'll get as close as I can. Maybe the principle from some of this is maybe we need to get as far from sin. You know, one of the other ones he says here, let me find my place. Paul forbids Christian leaders to get drunk because when drunk, one can lose control and inhibitions are down. This would be a detriment to any Christian in Crete because these people were drunks. They drank all the time. And they all drank. Children drank. Everybody drank. A part of the pagan worship was getting drunk. And believe me, Crete, they believed in Crete that Zeus had come down to Crete. That Zeus was born in Crete. So these people worshiped Zeus. It would be a detriment to the church to place someone in charge, or even for Christians themselves to get drunk. Because in this culture, they needed to be different to make a difference. Does that make sense? Do I want to say more on that? No, I think not at this point. Good principle for us. Yeah, I am. I'm going. Let's say I have a son who just went through alcohol and drug rehab. I've shared that with y'all, so I don't mind saying it. He's doing real good. He's been very successful. He's staying clean. I think he's at 60-something days now or something like that. What would I be thinking if that child, as old as he is, comes to my house and I can have a beer? Where's the love? Man, we have got to care so much about people that I will never do something again if it might cause somebody else to fall. That's love. That's grace. That's mercy. That ain't not drinking or not smoking or not whatever the heck. I've had people come to me and say, my teenage daughter's sleeping around, and I'm looking at them because I've known them 6 months and they've been with 4 different people. And I'm like, straighten your own self up before you start raging on somebody else. I think Jesus had something to say about that. Pull the log out of your eye before you try to take the speck out of somebody else's. There's principle here, big time. Paul was telling these folks, even if it's not personally wrong for you, you can't do this stuff and be effective for the kingdom, especially in Crete. I think our culture is a whole lot like Crete. Okay, I won't go further there. Then Paul goes on to say that one must be ready to welcome guests. That's a big, fat, hard, incredible thing Paul's asking them to do. Now, he says, be hospitable. That's easy. I can be hospitable to any of you all. But that's not what it meant in Paul's day. What it meant in Paul's day were if Christians came to your town and they needed a place to stay, you took them in, whether you knew them or not. And you fed them and you took care of them, even if all you had was a little bread and water. And even if they had to sleep on the floor. It also meant, because remember, we're already into the early church, there's already persecution coming on, so believe it or not, there were Christian refugees at this time. And if they came to town, Paul's telling them, you got to take them in. Because that's so different from the culture. Do you know what the culture of Crete would do? They would fleece them. They would take them for everything they had. They would rob them. And they would feel good about it. Look what I did today. So Paul is saying, you got to do the opposite. Boy, there's a principle there. I hope all of us are being hospitable as best we can. I hope that we are not shutting ourselves off as we meet people and learn who they are and what they need. Heaven help us. Did you notice here, nowhere did Paul say be safe? Oh, Paul, couldn't you have added that in there? He goes on to say, welcome guests, take in traveling Christians. Then he says, I want you to be holy. The word here, when it's translated, means separate. He's been telling them that all along. Everything he's told them to do is going to separate them from the culture. He tells them, be holy, be separate. And then he says, now be godly. Oh, Paul, really? What did God do? I don't know. God became flesh and came to the earth and gave his life for us. So what does it mean to be godly? I need to be giving my life away all the time for the kingdom. Not for stuff that's not eternal. Do I go there? Yes. Folks, stop giving your life away, your time away, your money away to stuff that's not eternal. Okay, that's all I'm saying about that. Then self-controlled. Told him not to get angry easily, be self-controlled. You got to be the opposite of what's out there. Self-control's hard. And okay, I'm going here too. Self-control does not just mean I don't open my mouth. Self-control means I deal with the anger that's inside. Self-control means that I don't just